For decades, Africa exported its crude oil only to buy back refined fuel from the rest of the world. Now, Africa's richest man says that he wants to change that colonial model. Aliko Dangote has confirmed plans to build a new mega-refinery in Kenya's port city of Lamu. If completed, it would be the largest refinery in East Africa and Dangote's biggest energy investment outside of Nigeria. According to reports, the project is estimated to cost around $17 billion, with a planned capacity of 700,000 barrels a day. The refinery will be built in Lamu on Kenya's Indian Ocean coast, and if everything goes according to plan, construction is expected to take about 30 months. Now, the project is designed to process more crude oil inside Africa instead of exporting it overseas and importing finished fuel at a higher price. It also extends Dangote's refining network across the continent. With Lagos on Africa's Atlantic coast and Lamu on the Indian Ocean, Dangote is building the continent's first two-coast energy empire. Reports say the site surveys, soil testing, and early engineering work are already underway for the refinery in Lamu. Kenya's location makes it a natural distribution hub.
All right. Welcome to This Week in Africa, your weekly live stream where we talk about all things Africa news and bring you up to speed on what you should know. I'll be joined momentarily by our co-host, Gloria Ayo, but I am Joe Hatagwa, the founder of Authentic African Media, and what we do is we help people visit, move, and invest in Africa. We also do these weekly live streams where we talk about things happening on the continent of Africa so you can be aware of what's happening in places you might be planning to visit, move, and invest in. As you heard at the top, Dangote is building a $17 billion oil refinery in Kenya. We also are going to cover the fact that France has officially exited the Burkina Faso region. Also, we'll talk a little bit more about why Nigeria's Dangote Refinery just bought UAE crude oil. We'll speak more about Russia versus Ukraine, the proxy war, and Moscow accusing Kyiv of exporting its conflict to Africa, mainly and namely the Sahel states. We'll talk about China's signing an agreement targeting Namibia's oil, uranium, and critical minerals. And then lastly, if we have time, we'll talk about Kenya and Tanzania launching a coordinated crackdown to stop the July 7th Sabasaba protest. And if there's additional time, we have some briefs from around the continent, Russia's U.S. influence in the Sahel and who's trying to get what power, Nigeria versus South Africa tensions. We'll talk about Mali-Algeria relations, and if we can, we'll talk about Zimbabwe's political situation and Nigeria's fake government agency scandal, if there is time. Now, before we continue this story on the oil refinery in Kenya, in Lamu, Kenya, let's talk a little bit about who Aliko Dangote is. So for many of you, you may or may not know this. He's a Nigerian businessman and what many people will call an industrialist who is the wealthiest person in Africa. He's also the richest Black individual in the world. Some people estimate his net worth to be between 34 and 38 billion dollars. He supplies a number of different goods. There are, sugars, cement, noodles, obviously oil. There's a number of different Dangote products that really find themselves around the continent of Africa, especially around West Africa. So he is the largest cement producer in Africa, operating across 10 African countries with a capacity of nearly 50 million metric tons annually of cement. He also had a $20 billion massive mega project and oil refinery in Lekki, which is in Lagos, that began fuel refining operations in early 2024 as the largest single train refinery in the world. It actually processes 650,000 barrels per day to satisfy Nigeria's fuel needs and to export energy globally. His group controls massive market shares, as I mentioned, in sugar refining, including the largest refinery in sub-Saharan Africa, salt refining, flour milling, and fertilizer production. So he was born in 1957 in Kano, Nigeria. He does come from a prominent Hausa Muslim family with wealthy traders, and he did graduate from university in Egypt and got a business loan from his uncle in 1977 to launch a trading firm. So throughout the 70s and 80s, he grew a business by importing commodities like rice and sugar. And his pivotal transformation occurred in 1999 when he pivoted to domestic manufacturing to help African nations self-sufficient, a vision what he calls the industrialization of Africa. So that's a little bit about Aliko Dangote. I think a lot of people bring him up when they talk about the wealthiest black men in the world. People bring him up when they talk about the wealthiest African. And so that gives you a little bit of an understanding of who he is and his vast business empire. It is not without controversy. There are a lot of conversations and questions around his wealth and monopolies, etc. But that is just what we felt you needed to know. So now let's get back to this story so you guys have a little bit more context around the $17 billion East Africa oil refinery. So as mentioned, it's a $17 billion refinery in Kenya's port city of Lamu, and the project could become the largest refinery in East Africa, where he has the largest refinery in sub-Saharan Africa currently. So as a planned capacity of 700,000 barrels per day, as you might remember, the one he has in Lekki is 650,000 barrels per day. So this refinery in Kenya will eclipse the refinery he has in Lagos. And it would extend his energy footprint, obviously, beyond Nigeria and create a two-coast refining network, obviously stretching from Lagos on the Atlantic to Lamu on the Indian Ocean. It's supposed to aim to reduce Africa's dependence on imported fuel by processing more crude oil on the continent. In the next video, we'll talk about how he's actually purchased some crude oil from the UAE. And so in theory, if this refinery, this crude oil refinery in Kenya gets up and running, then there'll be less reliance on importing crude oil externally and refining it in continent in Kenya to then produce it and make it available to the rest of the continent. And you can imagine if this is successful in Kenya, depending on the political environments and the business environments of other countries on the continent that also have crude oil, you would imagine there's a potential for oil refineries there. I will mention that Dangote has actually been also listed on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And I just want to give you some insight into that because that's also kind of an important part of the story. So as I mentioned, it's the conglomerate listed on it's called the Nigerian Exchange Group. So the company is Dangote Industries Limited, and the portfolio dominates the Nigerian capital market. It actually started trading at 1,000 naira, and it's the second most valuable company in Nigeria, commanding a market cap of 17.36 trillion naira. It just went public in the last 30 days. So this is maybe the last 60 days. So this is a kind of a big deal for the company in and of itself. All right, so with that, I'm going to get a little bit more back into this video because it does give a little bit more insight into the Dangote Refinery, what it means, and what we can expect from it. So We'll bring back on this video, and then we will have some commentary on the other side.
The East African country is perfectly positioned on the Indian Ocean to serve as the primary fuel valve for the entire region. From Lamu, refined fuel could be shipped across East Africa to countries like Uganda, South Sudan, Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC, helping to reduce the region's dependence on imported petroleum.
We do not want to be held hostage anymore by the Strait of Hormuz. We do not want to be held hostage by wars that are started by other people. We have our own resources here, and we are saying we are going to use our African resources to industrialize our region. And that is why we have asked Aliko Dangote here to do a research.
But building the refinery may be the easy part. Keeping it supplied with crude oil could be much harder. A refinery processing 700,000 barrels a day requires an uninterrupted supply of crude oil, and right now the regional supply chain is highly fractured. Kenya has yet to start commercial oil production. South Sudan's oil still depends on export routes through Sudan, and Uganda's future production is tied to a separate export pipeline to Tanzania. Now, that also sets up a new commercial contest. Uganda's oil projects are led by French giant Total Energies. Whether that crude is ever diverted to Dangote Refinery could become one of East Africa's biggest questions.
So as you can see, there are a lot of complexities for this to even get off the ground. As stated in that video, the easy part is actually building the refinery. The more difficult part is actually getting the crude oil to the refinery. So just for context, for everyone's aware, obviously there aren't many beyond this refinery and the one that's in Nigeria. And then Nigeria's also had a state-owned refinery as well that they built, but small in scale. And they reopened it. It was opened in the 70s, and I think they reopened it recently. Most crude oil leaves the continent, gets refined, gets sold back in the continent at higher prices, right? As you heard there, Uganda has a deal with Total Energy, which is one of the major French oil companies. And that is one of the biggest challenges in Africa. Not owning the supply chain means that Africa generates the least amount of revenue from the oil it produces itself. And this is not just an oil issue, it's an issue across many different commodities, right? And so as you hear from that story on Aliko Dangote's plans, it's to refine more products on the continent, right? He started doing that with sugar and salt milling, and then all the other things, right? So you're producing it on the continent and you're refining it and making it available for consumption and use by the end user all on the continent to distribute within the continent, so there's less reliance externally. You heard William Ruto, the president of Kenya, also make that statement on May the 12th of this year. In that same vein, obviously there are some challenges in Kenya as we speak with protests in regards to his regime. But what he was expressing there is something that we've been expressing on this live stream here, is that the continent needs to be refining the natural resources on the continent and selling it at the same global prices that other people are selling it for outside the continent. And also, of course, trading within the continent. And so, obviously there are a number of different contracts in place in these different countries, as stated in that video. So we'd like to see if there's any, if there will be any change in that, and so that more crude oil ends up coming to potentially the Dangote Refinery in Lamu, so that there won't need to be a purchase of crude oil outside the continent. I was going to play more of that video, but I realized in the interest of time, let's talk about why Nigeria's Dangote Refinery has bought UAE crude oil. So obviously, as I mentioned, the current refinery that's in Lekki, Lagos, Nigeria today is massive, and it does 650,000 barrels per day, as I mentioned. They had achieved, obviously, a new milestone. Some people had called it historic, by, of course, importing its first ever crude oil from the UAE. Now, there are a lot of conversations and questions about that practice, but let's just speak to the facts. Other reports confirm that the facility secured 2 million barrels of crude oil from Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And that move marks the major departure from its traditional reliance on African and previously American oil. So keep in mind that there was American crude oil also being funneled through the Dangote Refinery as well. So what I will do is play a little bit of this video. Now, this is from earlier this month. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, but this is all in relation to this expansion efforts in Lamu in Kenya, and it speaks to the reliance on getting oil from other places outside of the continent because of the crude oil deals that are in place today with European companies and countries, etc. So let's play a little bit from this video, and we'll have some commentary on the other side.
Our next story is from Nigeria. Africa's biggest oil refinery has just done something it has never done before. The massive Dangote Petroleum Refinery in Nigeria has officially bought crude oil from a Gulf giant, the United Arab Emirates. According to S&P Global Commodity Insights, Dangote secured 2 major cargoes of UAE crude. Reports say that 2 million barrels of crude were imported from the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, in the month of June. Now, this marks the refinery's very first purchase from the West Asian supplier. For a facility built in Africa's largest crude oil producing nation, this is a massive headline. It is a major departure from the African and American crude oil that the refinery usually runs on. So why is this happening right now? The answer comes down to 2 things: local shortages and global timing. First, let's look at the global stage. Now, this purchase follows a big shift in West Asia. An initial peace memorandum between the United States and Iran has eased tensions. Shipping lanes through the critical Strait of Hormuz have normalized. This has improved the availability of Gulf crude in international markets. Simply put, Dangote saw an opening and took it. But there is a deeper, more troubling reason closer to home. Nigeria is struggling to supply its own massive refinery. On paper, Dangote has a narrow for crude agreement, which is the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, the NNPC. Under this deal, the NNPC is supposed to supply between 13 and 15 cargoes of domestic crude every month. But in reality, persistent domestic shortages and operational bottlenecks keep getting in the way. Nigeria simply is not producing enough consistent feedstock to comfortably meet its export commitments and supply Dangote's growing demand.
So I'll leave it there and just give a little bit of commentary here. So as you can see in this video, they explained the reason why Dangote has decided to look outside of, obviously, Nigeria's own crude oil stock, because there are limitations based on all the things stated there in terms of what's available, but also supply chain challenges. And so they also use the United States crude oil as well. And then now they've made this order from the UAE. And it seems as if, or as though, that will likely be the case when the Lamu refinery gets off the ground as well, because we're talking about 700 barrels versus 700,000 barrels, versus the 650,000 barrels in Nigeria, in the Lamu refinery. And so that means that they will likely have to look elsewhere to be able to get the crude oil necessary to be able to meet that demand. So we will keep an eye on this and keep you guys posted. I wish we had Gloria here to give some insight as the resident Nigerian on the live stream, but we will hear from her in a little bit. Maybe she can give her thoughts whenever she's able to get on. In the meantime, we want to move to the Sahel and talk a little bit about what's happening in the Sahel. As you saw from the thumbnail, France has pulled all of its diplomats from Burkina Faso as Traoré ends Macron's era in the Sahel. As you may have noticed in the recent months, there have been deals done between France and now what we're calling the Anglophone countries. So we're talking about in Kenya, in Ghana, and in other countries. You've seen France really try to bolster its efforts to build on those relationships, because those in the Francophone countries have decided to reduce and almost eliminate their relationship with the French country. And so I think it's just important to know that the Sahel is thriving without France, and we will get into how they've been thriving. But first, let's just get to the story about how the Burkina Faso folks, in particular Ibrahim Traoré, has decided to basically completely remove France from Burkina Faso. So real quickly, let me give you some insight first, and then we'll get to the video. So Burkina Faso completed its most dramatic break yet from France as French diplomats leave the country following the formal severing of diplomatic relations by Captain Ibrahim Traoré's military government. Ouagadougou says the partnership with its former colonial ruler no longer rests on mutual respect or trust, while France has condemned the move as quote unquote a hostile and unfounded move. The rupture follows years of deteriorating relations, including the expulsion of French troops, the suspension of French media outlets, and repeated accusations that France is interfering in Sahel affairs. Burkina Faso says it wants to move independent foreign policy, wants a more, independent foreign policy based on diversified partnerships and South-South cooperation. So analysis say the decision could reshape diplomacy across the Sahel, where Mali and Niger have already moved sharply away from France. And so we will hear from First Post Africa on this story, and then we will have some commentary on the other side. So stay tuned.
The final thread linking France and Burkina Faso has now been cut. All French diplomats have now left Burkina Faso after Ouagadougou formally ended diplomatic relations with its former colonial ruler. It is the final step in a break that has been years in the making, and one that could reshape diplomacy across the Sahel. The French Foreign Ministry says all of its diplomats returned to France late last week. Paris has also ordered Burkina Faso's diplomatic staff to leave France. After Ouagadougou announced it was severing diplomatic relations with immediate effect on the 26th of June, and France has described the decision as hostile and unfounded. Burkina Faso says the break followed what it called an in-depth review of its relationship with France. The military government says the conditions for a partnership based on mutual respect and trust no longer exists.
All right. So, Gloria, now that we have you, I'd love to hear from you on the story here that France diplomats are finally out of Burkina Faso completely and fully. Your thoughts?
Yeah, apologies. But anyway, let me get right into it. So, when you hear certain words like hostile and unfounded, it's really mind-boggling, because I know France is not talking about any African country being hostile, and whatever decisions they make in the interest of their sovereignty, you're calling that unfounded. I don't understand what the fuss is. And I think what the Sahel has done, if we're looking at it from the angle of what the people want, it's precisely what the people have asked for. For many years, we've had people asking for Africa to be liberated from countries that come from outside the continent, to come to the continent, to exploit, extort, and there's never been equity. For the most part, we've not had countries that come in and respect us. And that's why when certain countries seem like they're getting more attention in parts of Africa, such as the Sahel, there's a reason. Even if we say those countries are not necessarily dealing with us perfectly, they're far more respectful when you think of certain countries that come to the continent to do things that are against the interest of the people. Again, I'm referencing uranium, and I'm going to use Niger as a case study. Niger has powered France for many years, and the country, Niger, has not been able to have electricity. You can't even compare the electricity in Niger with the electricity in France. And you're talking about hostile and unfounded. If you truly cared about the people, in the interest of being Pan-Africanist, as Macron has claimed he is, you will be lobbying for equity. I'm just using Niger as an example, because if we go down the list, we don't even have enough time. You would be lobbying for fairness in Niger. Didn't you see that the people didn't have as much light? Didn't you see that the standard of living was way below what it is in France? So when they're telling you to leave, and now you're going to other parts of Africa and trying to plant your flags in those countries, well, it is what it is. But based on what you have done throughout history and what you're still doing, I completely understand why the people, why the leaders in the AES have decided to do what they've done.
Absolutely. And I think just one thing I'll add to that is, the AES is the perfect example of what we, as folks who've been talking for years about Africa's independence, they're the perfect example of what it looks like to be independent. I mean, perfect example just in terms of being able to find ways to grow their countries, grow their economies without bad trade deals and working together. Now, there still has been some dependence on outside deals, right? Because obviously, as you mentioned, they are doing deals with other countries, specifically Russia, for example, and deals with China are happening all across the continent. And so there isn't a complete self-reliance. However, when you have all of your reliance on generally one country, and you haven't diversified that's a problem altogether. And also, if you haven't found a way to operate with your neighbors, with security agreements, with trade agreements that benefit the people, then all you're doing is lining the pockets of the wealthy. And that is why the coups in those countries, or what we're calling revolutions in those countries, have continued to succeed even after many attacks from the outside, right? And they continue to have support from people within their countries and outside of their countries, because we're able to see what they're doing for their people. Now, an example of that is what we're going to talk about with Burkina Faso in this next video. So between the 3rd of June between the 30th of June and the 3rd of July this year, Burkina Faso implemented several measures to improve the public health of its citizens. The government inaugurated a new clean drinking water production site, distributed 4 mobile hospitals to the army, and provided ambulances to rural villages. So this is a snapshot of a few of the new updates that comes amid a much broader effort to improve national and regional health. So on the 24th of December, Burkina Faso also inaugurated a university hospital center and its radiotherapy center and it's West Africa's largest teaching hospital, with support, of course, from China. So I'm going to play this video from Sovereign Media. I also shared it on my page as well. I'm a collaborator on it on Authentic Africans Instagram page. And so is Gloria as well. So you can find it on any of our Instagram pages, but we'll play this video and give you a little bit more insight into some of what Burkina Faso has done, in addition to, removing France, but finding ways to improve their country without its former colonial masters.
Burkina Faso is working to improve access to healthcare services throughout the country. On 3 July 2026, Burkina Faso's Prime Minister, Rim Talba Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo, inaugurated a center for producing clean, filtered drinking water in the rural community of Duru. The drinking water will serve the people in the towns of Yako, Bousse, and Gursi, as well as 8 villages. Meanwhile, on the front lines where the armed forces are fighting what the AES governments allege are Western-backed terrorist groups, the government provided soldiers with 4 new mobile hospitals on 1 July 2026. The hospitals are equipped with imaging facilities such as a scanner, an X-ray machine, and a lab for blood work. Each hospital also has a high-power generator to ensure reliable electricity access. On the same day, Burkina Faso celebrated a new cohort of nephrology doctors trained entirely within the country and ready to serve the local population. While 13 of the new doctors are Burkinabe in origin, 1 doctor is an international student from Congo and 1 is from Benin. The day prior, on 30 June 2026, the government of Burkina Faso provided 2 rural villages in the Zandoma province with fully equipped ambulances for medical emergencies. These villages had previously been using motorbikes and bicycles to transport sick patients in need of urgent care. Each of these events, aimed at improving health conditions in Burkina Faso, occurred over a span of 4 days from 30 June to 3 July 2026.
All right, if you guys want to watch the rest of the video, you can head over to either one of our Instagram pages to watch that. But Gloria, just maybe let's give some thoughts to what has been done here. And actually, you know what? Let me do this before we do that, because I realize that there's another story that I wanted to cover that I sent in our group chat. And really quickly, it's not a video, but I'll just share a really big update. And we haven't covered that yet. So sorry, let me just do that really quickly. But, so also, in addition to what you just saw in that video, on the 9th of July, so that was between June 30th and July 3rd, what we just talked about, or what you just saw in that video. On the 9th of July, the government of Burkina Faso approved the launch of the country's first state-owned and operated industrial gold mine. The mine is located in the town of Yako, the birthplace of Thomas Sankara, who obviously was one of the more prominent revolutionary leaders of the continent of Africa, who was unfortunately unalived and removed from office. And that's a conversation we definitely need to have. But we've kind of spoken about him previously, guys. If you're not aware, look it up. And his estimated, and so, and this mine has an estimated 10.7 million tons of ore. So the government anticipates that this mine will create 1,200 local jobs in the community, while the government plans to spend over $56 million on the project. The expected revenue will likely exceed $68 million. So Burkina Faso, like its neighbors Mali and Niger, is working to exercise greater control over its resources. Under President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has nationalized 5 gold mining assets, including 2 different mines previously owned by London-listed Endeavour Mining. The nationalization of this particular mine was also finalized under Ibrahim Traoré. So the mine was previously controlled by Canada's mining corporation, or one of Canada's mining corporations, Trevali, but was shut down after 8 Burkinabe miners lost their lives trapped underground. So now let's get to our thoughts. So I'd love to hear from you, Gloria, on this story of Burkina Faso kind of taking control of its resources and continuing to make strides towards rebuilding its country and really taking control of its resources and its health.
Yes, and this is part of why countries like France have to leave, because you can't have true sovereignty of your own resources if you have certain people there who are only there to protect the interests of their countries. Of course, I just made reference and did the comparison, the case study of Niger and France and the state of both countries. And one country was powering and fueling, basically helping the other country. So this is all we're about. And this is why, regardless of how you feel about the leaders of the Sahel, you cannot deny the fact that it feels great seeing our leaders taking control of our own resources. And going specifically to Burkina Faso, we saw thank you, sovereign media. Thank you. This is why we need our own media. Thank you so much, sovereign media. We know there's been some things that have happened in the past that have clamped down on free speech of people, basically being able to highlight, the great things happening on our continent. And that brings me to another point, the media. We've time and time repeatedly talked about the coverage that we get in the news. When Joe and I are sourcing for stories throughout the continent, and when it comes specifically to the Sahel, anytime it's something negative, we see a lot of stories on it. We see a lot of major platforms covering it. But everything else that has been covered, such as the things we're highlighting, taking control of their gold mines, building infrastructure, the hospitals, training the people, we don't see that. We don't see that in major, on any major news platform. And this is why we need platforms such as Sovereign Media. This is why we need platforms such as Authentic African, because now it's about what is truly, truly going on. I'm here for the sovereignty of Africa, and I'm here for the fair, clear, and accurate depiction of what is going on in the Sahel.
Absolutely. I mean, look, Teachers Hospital, bringing in teachers from around the continent, the biggest in sub-Saharan Africa, which is huge. And then also the fact that they're, obviously building the gold mine and taking back their natural resources, because these are all things that, of course, that a very few wealthy elite were benefiting from. And this was the issue that led to the revolution in the first place. And so, look, from what we're seeing, Ibrahim Traoré is delivering on the promise, the things that the people of his country have been asking for. And I always mention that seeing something like this will give other African leaders ideas, not maybe the current crop of leadership, but those who are growing up and who are thinking about getting into politics. I hope that this inspires them, just like Thomas Sankara inspired Ibrahim Traoré. I think we anticipate that there's going to be a new crop of leaders coming out that will have very similar mindsets and will operate in very similar ways. And this is against the backdrop of, sanctions on Mali. Those still have not been lifted, right? Mali has been under sanctions for years. I don't even have the exact number of years that they've been under sanctions. And every year, they're one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, all three of the countries in the Sahel, last I checked, I think last week, there was some reports out that they've all seen an average of about 5% GDP growth year on year over the last couple of years, which is in direct conflict with where they were previously, or in opposition or exact opposite of where they were under the previous regimes. So obviously what they're doing is working. And, as you said, we are here for the expansion. I don't know if we want to go back to the previous story on Aliko Dangote's expansion to the refineries in Limu. And I also played a video because it's also relevant that it was saying that Nigeria's crude oil is not enough to be able to fully support the 650,000 barrels per day production that is happening at the Lekki refinery. The Limu refinery is going to be 700,000 barrels per day. And there's all kinds of supply chain issues. Did you have any thoughts that you wanted to give on that story of the new refinery in Kenya before we move on to some of the other stories?
Yeah, well, what I would say about it, obviously, we know that Dangote has, there have been a lot of challenges regarding what Dangote is doing with fuel. Again, sovereignty. Anytime there's a conversation around sovereignty, it's always some drama around it, because there are certain forces that don't want Africans to just, and it's sad, but it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but time and time again, this fact has been proven. You have external forces that are not looking out for the people as they claim that they are. They're only looking out for their own interests. But one thing I will commend Dangote for is the fact that, we've seen him doing what he can to partner on the continent, regardless of how I feel about certain leaders or anything like that, is keeping it on the continent. And those are the kinds of things where we've been talking about, because Africa in itself is self-contained, and it should be able to, or rather, what's the term I'm looking for? It should be self-reliant. Everything that Africa needs is right there for Africans. You don't have to go outside necessarily, but if you absolutely must, ensure that it's an equal partnership. Absolutely. I hope that answered what you're saying. I guess maybe because I didn't see the videos or anything, but those are actually my thoughts on the Dangote story.
Sure, no problem. And so, yeah, I think that what you're saying there is important, because again, it comes back to the self-reliance, right? Unfortunately, because of bottlenecks and previous relationships, there is some reliance on others. One of the things that I found from the research on this is that not only is the crude oil coming from Nigeria, but there's also American crude oil being refined in the Dangote Refinery. And then the other video that I had played just spoke about the fact that they recently purchased some crude oil from the UAE as well. And it just speaks to the resource bottlenecks, the supply chain challenges, and and also previous partnerships that are in place that are hard to move from. Right. And so, but at least the refineries are there, and gives the opportunity to eventually get to a place where the continent can be more self-reliant. Speaking on reliance and outside interference, First Post Africa reports on Russia versus Ukraine proxy war. What they describe as that's what they describe it as. And what they're saying is Moscow is accusing Kyiv of exporting conflict to Africa. So a little bit from First Post, they said the Russian-Ukraine conflict is increasingly spilling beyond Europe, with Africa emerging as the largest area in their geopolitical rivalry. During a visit to Burundi, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Ukraine of supporting armed groups fighting governments across Africa, including the DRC. Kyiv has rejected these allegations as Kremlin disinformation, accusing Moscow of trying to distract from Russia's own activities across the continent. I will play this video from First Post Africa, and we will have some commentary on the other side.
Russia has opened a new front in its war of words with Ukraine. Now this time, the battlefield is Africa, caught between two warring powers. The latest claim came during Sergei Lavrov's visit to Burundi, the final stop of his Africa tour. The Russian foreign minister accused Ukraine of backing forces fighting governments across Africa in order to weaken Russia's partners on the continent.
Ukrainians are attempting to side with forces opposing legitimate governments in far too many conflicts on the African continent, solely in order to establish themselves as a political force on the African continent, and most importantly, to cause trouble for countries friendly to Russia.
Lavrov also extended those claims to the Democratic Republic of Congo. He alleged Ukrainian personnel were supporting rebels fighting the Congolese government.
Устранить.
The legitimate government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with Burundi's support, is overcoming the aggression being waged against it by the so-called M23 group, which is backed by foreign representatives, including Ukrainians.
Это наша позиция.
Kyiv has rejected the accusations outright. Ukrainian officials say Lavrov's claims about the Democratic Republic of Congo are unsupported by evidence.
So this is the first I am hearing of M23 being supported by Ukraine. So that is a quite the accusation. And I think it's an interesting one. I mean, we've heard a lot of things about potentially Rwanda, potentially countries in, West Asia, formerly called the Middle East. Your thoughts, though, on this new accusation, and maybe just in general, what we've been hearing, even amongst the Sahelian states and their conversations about the Ukraine and its interference in that region.
Yeah, those are some really heavy accusations. But Joe, I'm going to kind of come from a completely different angle. When we see stories like this, of course, this is the first time, like you said. I mean, it's kind of been, they've kind of had the back and forth, but this is like, I guess, some sort of climax as far as this particular story. Of course, at one point it was about who is taking African fighters. Is it Russia? Is it Ukraine? Now, but who are they fighting over? The continent of Africa. I don't care what anyone says about Africa. You can call Africa whatever it is you want to call Africa. But one thing you cannot deny is that Africa powers the world. There's a reason a country as powerful as America, there's a reason France, the UK, there's a reason Ukraine, there's a reason all these countries are fighting themselves to ensure that they are the ones who have access to Africa. And the question that I keep asking is, are our leaders even aware of how powerful we are? That's why when you go do some agreements, that the partnerships are clearly not equal. It's confusing to us because you don't even know what is underneath your own ground. Everything is on the continent of Africa. But what Africa has lacked throughout its history is good leadership. If only we had good leadership. Thankfully, the people are aware, the people are awake. Our ancestors, unfortunately, didn't have access to the information we have now. But our leaders are aware. That's the question. You're having Ukraine now and Russia accusing themselves. Who is fueling conflict in Africa? Man, I get goosebumps. The potential of Africa. It's so unfortunate, Joe. Beautiful, beautiful continent.
Yeah. I mean, and so I'll just add to it. I mean, so the first time we've ever heard Ukraine added to specifically the conflict in the DRC. So this is new. The Russian foreign minister has mentioned Ukraine's involvement in the Sahel. We recently, just to go through some of the recent stories and some of the history. There was 1,500 troops, non-military, like Malian government, troops that were doing coordinated attacks across Mali just a few weeks ago. And there was questions about who was sponsoring it. Ukraine was obviously accused of being a part of it, one of the sponsors of this. You had an attack at an airport in Niger, which also in that case, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine was also accused in that instance. We do know that the Ukraine did take responsibility for the unaliving of a number of Malian troops, I think about 2 years ago, by some rebel forces. So it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that those things could be true. I think to the point you're making, just around African leaders and how they have been handling our natural resources and the deals that we've been having, I think historically the issue has been that those deals have been great deals for the individuals who are making themselves independently wealthy, but obviously bad deals for the entire country that they're meant to serve. And that's what led to the revolutions in the Sahel in the first place. So it all does come back to leadership and the natural resources. And as you mentioned, Africa does power the world. And so regaining that power is going to take some time, but we do have some bright lights in certain regions working to do so. Okay, with that, we are limited on time. There were two more stories that we were going to cover. China's Xi Jinping signs an agreement targeting Namibia's oil, uranium, and critical minerals. And then we also did want to try to cover Kenya and Tanzania launching a coordinated effort to crack down on the July 7th Sabasaba protest. I think in the interest of time, we don't have time to play the videos and to go through the stories. Do we want to do, I'll just do a high level reading of what the background on China and this agreement with Namibia, and then maybe we'll get to the Kenya-Tanzania coordinated effort before we go. So Namibia is what we're saying, First Post Africa is saying is redefining its economic partnership with China, shifting away from the traditional raw material extraction model towards domestic value addition. So during an official state visit to Beijing, Namibian president secured 8 strategic cooperation agreements spanning architecture, infrastructure, and green minerals. And this is as Namibia prepares to potentially become Africa's 4th largest oil producer by 2030, holding billions of barrels of offshore crude alongside massive deposits of uranium, lithium, and rare earth elements. So the nation is using its newfound resource wealth as immense geopolitical and economic leverage. Any thoughts on this number of agreements across these different sectors between Namibia's president and China?
Yeah, and I will stand on what I've always said. I am for intra-continental trade, but if we must step outside, it has to be fair. And and that goes back to my point that I made earlier about certain countries that we feel more comfortable with, regardless of, what I mean? I'm not going to deny that there might be some question marks here and there as far as how they do certain things. But when you compare countries like China, Russia, I think even Turkey, there's some partnership on the continent. When you compare these countries with what certain countries have done, it's a huge contrast. But I do want to commend the Namibian president. Of course, we're hoping that, we're dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's. But I definitely do commend the fact that this woman has done what she can. But we haven't had, I don't think there's such a thing as perfect leadership per se. But from what I understand, she's aiming for something that's more fair as far as in this deal with China.
Absolutely. And I'll just quickly add that, look, we're spanning across multiple industries. And I think one important one is manufacturing, or two important ones, manufacturing and infrastructure. Because as you guys are probably aware, China has probably been the foremost leader in manufacturing and infrastructure over the last 25 to 30 years. In fact, so much so that the manufacturing of almost all of the goods and services that the United States sells domestically has been some way, somehow through the East Asian pipeline, right? Whether that's Malaysia or Taiwan or China, much of the goods manufactured and that end up being goods and that are used in the States do come from there, and from many parts of the world, in fact. And so I do think it's important that if you're going to try to build out this infrastructure as a country, you learn from those who've done it at a high level and have really turned around the kind of the global trade through the use and the growth of these sectors. So that's what I'll say in terms of the deals and the understandings. I mean, ideally, we want to be self-sufficient, but maybe this is a step towards that process. Now we are running out of time, so we don't have time to go into the story of Kenya and Tanzania executing a coordinated show of force to suppress planned anti-government protests that were supposed to happen on July 7th. But I will say that as we go on, these are the themes and the topics we're covering: economic independence, sovereignty, and also civil disobedience. I think those are kind of the topics that we tend to cover here. And we will always stand with the people and look for a more equitable and also self-reliant continent. Any final thoughts before we go?
I think we've covered everything, but thank you all so much for tuning in. See you next time.
All right, thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to follow us on all platforms at The Gloria AO and at Diaspora Station. And then, of course, at Authentic African across all platforms. So we'll see you guys all shortly. Bye, guys.